Tokyo. By the way, on leadership, I must make a couple of points. Actually, just thinking and flicking through what you've been discussing, I actually talk about leadership. In fact, I just spoke to all the law graduates coming through the University of Melbourne on Tuesday. Because, by the way, actually, they're quite a nervy bunch because the market has dramatically shifted in Australia, and what was a very benign market for law students has actually become quite malign because the transactional work is down, the economy is actually not moving tickaboo as people said it would, and there's actually some quite significant challenges out there. So I was just trying to get people to focus on alternates, and because I actually was saying to them, for me, leadership, by the way, is actually part of self-motivation, but thinking about how I view my role in life and just thinking about how you might have been developing up this process today, a lot of it's about understanding the past, and I think you've had plenty of that. I mean, you're in the hallowed halls of ANU, a place which has actually spent a lot of time thinking deeply about the history of Australia. In fact, it was sort of founded very much around the thoughts around the Australia-Indonesia relationship and actually led there. Managing the present, and I actually did hear that a number of those issues have been sort of discussed. I mean, the current state of the relationship, in fact, I could talk about the current state of the relationship. I think Kirsten and Mark have settled on that as well. But actually where I think maybe I can add a little bit of value is actually, I think about leadership about enlarging the future. And I actually want to think a bit more about enlarging the future of the relationship. Not just managing it, as sometimes we're prone to do, and minimising risk in the relationship, but how do you enlarge the relationship? And I suppose that then flips back to why do I even feel vaguely qualified, perhaps not necessarily qualified, but why do I think I have any relevance to actually discuss this issue? A couple of things just to throw out there. So my previous career, my first career, I was in the Foreign Service, but I left, I was expelled as a non-conformist entrepreneur. Didn't quite fit the club. But a couple of things I've done subsequently. So I actually chaired the Trade and Investment Experts Group on Indonesia under the Howard government in 2006, 2007. And you'd be quite surprised, and this is why I sort of think a lot of this is about managing the present. The exact same issues, I mean, the quantums have changed, but the magnitudes not significantly, were discussed in 2006 as they discussed in 2013. And if I hear another political leader say that we are going to, as a government, increase trade and investment from Australia into Indonesia, I think I'll just say, well, look, get real. For a start, governments can't do that. We make our decisions as private sector players as to where we allocate our capital, and we manage our risk. What you can do is actually understand that creating an environment and helping support an environment that facilitates private investment is actually very important. And by the way, what you say at home should actually kind of match what you say abroad. So I think there's some, possibly, vaguely some controversial thoughts underlying all that. The other, which you might find quite interesting, is that I actually was one of the 4 people who reviewed the development assistance budget under the, I suppose when Rudd was Prime Minister, then he was Foreign Minister, but I did the aid effectiveness review, and I looked very seriously at this issue. And in particular, you may be shocked at this, but I insisted upon the provision in that report of an obligation for AusAid to establish clear performance indicators around aid effectiveness and report back on those up to Cabinet on an annual basis. And if they're unable to establish that Australia's existing funding was not being spent effectively, then the trajectory of our progress towards 0.5 GNI should be suspended. And actually that was a mechanism which was greeted with horror. But at the same time was actually, if you think about it, my big concern was how do you maintain public confidence in the actual development aid trajectory? And I learnt a lot. I also learnt a lot about aid agencies, because I can't say that I was, I did actually work with the World Bank at one stage in South Asia, but I don't pretend to be a development economist. But I did learn that there was a dissonance between, and I know there's AusAid people here, between the way in which I as a citizen and I as a private sector participant in the economy look at development assistance and the way in which it's actually often looked at from within aid agencies. For a start, they talk about aid rather than development assistance much more often. And actually there's this quite a significant tension that we often don't acknowledge, between what is often seen as the cultural underpinnings of an organisation where, and I'm talking about AusAid, but I can also talk about USAID, I can talk about Canada Aid, I can talk about New Zealand Aid, I can talk about a lot of them because I actually had a look at them all, where they actually see their role as almost like the Australian NGO rather than actually an instrument of government policy. And I know that's a controversial thought, and many will disagree because they'll say that actually that's not what we say, but actually I look at what people do. And then match it against rhetoric. And the reason I say that is because one of the big issues, and you mentioned it, particularly the whole issue of alleviation of poverty, you go back to the MDG principles, etc. And that the fundamental element, and I think we sort of shouldn't deny this, that has actually moved towards the dramatic improvement on alleviation of poverty has been economic growth. And actually, if you look at the underpinnings of economic growth, it's actually been the functioning of markets and the role of the private sector. And understanding that, I know there's attempts to do that, understanding that's very important because there is actually a significant and important role for the private sector in actually the development objectives of the countries involved and of those who want to spend my money as a taxpayer as well. And there is a tension, which we often don't talk about. And the tension is that a lot of the practitioners in development assistance actually see the prime issue around humanitarian and also see that there's not really a low, I mean, business is actually a rent seeker in this play and business is only fiddling around because they want to make a buck. What they don't actually understand often is that the actual interest of the private sector is enlarging markets, and actually that enlarging of those markets can actually help stimulate economic growth. So it's actually in our interest to have functioning markets all over the place. So we focus a little bit on that. So, so you may be interested. The other is I chair United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So when the Indonesia discussion in Australia is often reduced down to cattle, boats, prisoners and Bali, I kind of cover at least one of those areas. But I do go to Bali. I've just been up there for APEC with current PM. But really around this issue of asylum seekers and humanitarian. So maybe we can talk about that actually, because it's actually one of those interesting issues for me because I also have just been setting up Human Rights Watch in Australia. And we actually did an interesting piece about if we're talking functioning democracy to functioning democracy, when are we going to start talking again about human rights in both countries? Because at the moment, anything that actually smacks of a human rights discussion is kind of smacked down because it might actually get in the way of a functioning relationship. By the way, I think the relationship is mature institutionally, very mature, and actually we need to be open to those sorts of discussions. I think it's a good, healthy discussion. And then the other element I'll just touch on is around the Australia in the Asian Century, where I was one of the 3 non-government actors who were involved in the formation of that paper. The rhetoric will move around whether it's who owned, I mean, by the way, the political rhetoric in Australia around the Australian-Asian century was about who owned Asia. That was actually Liberal Party or Labor Party. That was actually what it got reduced down to, but I kind of ignore all the stuff as Canberra prattle. But what I was actually interested in was the actual underpinnings of the Australian-Asian century, which is really how do you enlarge the future of this nation? And actually, if anyone actually spends a bit of time looking at it, the paper was actually never a foreign policy paper, it was actually a domestic reform paper. Because what was this, how do you continue to encourage settings that will support an open economy in Australia? And how do you actually engage with Asia in a really effective way? And part of that was trying to understand how we prioritise our relationships, our economic diplomacy, but actually understanding and have become a very important part of our national interest, a common interest for the region to continue to grow. And if you believe in that, then what are the potential impediments to the region to continue to grow? Obviously there's security impediments, but I focus a little bit because I work on this particularly in APEC, where I chair finance and economics. One of the big impediments is that we don't actually have functioning regional capital markets. The financial markets do not operate an effective way on a regional basis. And if you think about it, and you think about Indonesia, I'm sure you've had all these macros and micros in the discussions, you know, the really high proportion of finance which is actually involved around bank financing compared to other instruments. And that's partly because there's actually a lack of development in financial markets. That is actually a potential inhibitor to the growth of the region. In fact, if you look at the region on the macros, the region invests more, as you might know this, the numbers off by heart, Kirsten, but the region invests more outside the region than invests in the region. That's for good reason, because there's actually an ability to find a lot of instruments which you can actually use to invest in the region. So I'm actually part of this group which is working through what's called an Asia Pacific Financial Forum, the idea of which is to enlarge the future of the region, because we're trying to resolve this heady issue, or this challenging issue of deepening financial markets. And the reason I point on that, because it actually points really to one of the big challenges for enlarging the region, which is, I mean, finance is only one part of it. It's how do you move from just market access issues, which has really been the dialogue for maybe the first 20 years of APEC, Asia-Pac discussions, to the big issue, which now is around regional economic integration. One part of which is actually financial markets, but actually for those of you who think about this, it's behind the border reforms. How do you quickly set up a company? These are actually domestic reforms. They're not delivered by region, like, you know, the Europeans will take a view that you must have a formal treaty to do that. Hence you have the EU, which is a dysfunctional mess. Asia Pacific has always taken the view you do this on a voluntary basis, which is why the APEC way, the genius of the APEC way is actually the converse of what people actually think it is, because most people think it's the weakness that it's voluntary and that it's non-obligatory, but actually if you think about the Asian way, the fact that it's actually encouraging capability building, opting in, etc. And we actually acknowledge that to actually look at the next stage of development, it's all about behind the border reforms, and it's really then about structural reforms, microeconomic reforms, about how you get businesses up. And that leads me to my last observation, because I think we did want to close it on 10. I actually think that, as I said, enlarging the future of the relationship is one of the most exciting aspects of leadership, and as young leaders, I think it's something hopefully you'll agree on. I actually think where we get it wrong, going back to my first comments when I looked at the debates that were going on in 2006, and by the way, when I looked at the debates going on in 2006, because I'm by training a historian, I actually looked back at actually the debates that had taken place in the 70s and the 80s. And it's actually quite interesting how similar they all were. Institutionally, we don't do badly in terms of managing the relationship at a diplomatic level, but it's really getting to that next level of texture. And the reason I say that becomes relevant here is that I think Australia has failed to understand contemporary Indonesia, and partly because it's captured by a mindset which is still about big projects, big energy projects, projects that went bad in the 80s when everyone invested there because you couldn't get your money out, you burned a lot of capital, but actually failed to understand the changing nature of the Indonesian economy. And I'm not just talking about digital, but I'm also talking about the generational change that's going on there. And the fact that you are seeing almost the third generation post-independence come through, and they're just simply different interests. And obviously with the digital platform, you're going to have different opportunities there. And the power of SM and SMMEs, it is completely undercooked. And you can understand why, because they're appallingly organised. And most of the big business councils are all captured by big business because they have the resources to do so and the time. But you know, no one's talking about the opportunity for that huge wave of engagement at a digital level between SMEs. And of course for SMEs, one of the most important aspects is like ease of setting up, access to capital, financing, all those sorts of issues, and we don't talk about that. In fact, we're still talking about, you know, tollways and big infrastructure projects. And the other reason, and by the way, of course we should still talk about those, but the relationship is totally characterised by that, and it's almost like we better have some small business people along just to make it look like we're interested in it. I say that, and I'm sure that's not true. But the other point I was going to make is that, you know, we have argued in Australia, and I'm going back to my human rights hat, and you talk about institutionalisation and democracy. I mean, I think Andrew McIntyre put it very well here. Australia has actually failed to recognise that Indonesia is a functioning democracy. In many senses, there's actually a yearning for the old big man theory of exercise of political power. But it's not as though Indonesia is necessarily unique here. One of the challenging aspects of, this is a global view, so it's, I'm sure you'll find precise details to differ with. Just take this as a particular way of thinking things through. You know, Southeast Asia, and particularly Asian economies, particularly in the post-Second World War, and in particular with the level of growth that took place in the 60s and the 70s, were really characterised in terms of political economy by very strong executives. And actually, if you start even looking, and you looked at this you would have looked at this in Singapore. I mean, Singaporeans know Australian politics very well, but I bet you most Australians wouldn't know that the Singapore government almost froze itself into panic because of a by-election in one particular seat, where the PPP almost didn't lose, but actually they were actually, oh my God, something's changed here. And the actual nature of the way in which the Singapore government operates now is quite different. It's much more consultative. It's not willed. The bargain in Singapore was always, we'll make it all comfortable for you, but just shut up and let us get on with our business. What I'm saying about Indonesia, and I'd say this about India, and I'd say this about Malaysia, and I'd say about elsewhere, China as well, we fail to understand that one of the consequences of democracy is actually a level of inefficiency. Heavens above, why we'd actually do that bedevils me when you look at America. When you look at Australia, the actual inability of the COAG process, Council of Australian Governments, to operate, even with a relatively small economy, the inefficiencies we have as a consequence of democracy. But power has moved from Jakarta. Devolution of authority slows things down. People have different views, there are different stakeholders, and yet we're still thinking a lot about the relationship as Canberra-Jakarta. I mean, it's not even like Jakarta or Geneva. I mean, is anyone thinking about Makassar? Is anyone actually thinking about where do we seriously put the next consulate? Surely it should be in Bali. Surely it should be around East Java. But I don't know where that debate's going to go. But actually, I think we have to think about all this differently. And I think in terms of enlarging the future of the relationship, that's where I think you guys can make a difference if you want to focus on those sorts of issues. And as I said, please take my speech as read.
Thank you, John.